Bottom of the S, the severity of the climate change challenge, and the severity of a carbon-constrained world. And then as you move in your mind up that S to the midpoint of the S, I'd like you to know that social networks and social systems, just in the 25 years of my firm, have made 61% of the Fortune 500 go out of business for probably good social cleansing purposes. So that the bottom of the S frontier that I want to talk to you about, which is social response capitalism, is about the reality that when a firm mismanages its human capital, its products, its relationship to social expectations and the law, BP winds up buying Arco of Los Angeles on fire. BP winds up buying Amoco. Union Carbide bets the ranch on that tragic accident that killed 2,700 people in Bhopal. And in 1995, I wrote a book called The Avalanche of Change Since Bhopal. So at age 52, I'd like to let you know that I probably spent too much of my life on the bottom half of the S, writing about how to pin corporate scandal to the wall, how to improve environmental and energy regulation, and also how to make change by telling firms what they should do. So for example, you all should know that in my record, my 5 prior books were books that Congress used to amend hazardous waste laws or evolve the Federal Facilities Compliance Act that made the Department of Defense accountable to the same standards of the environmental law. So the lawyers in my group and the advisors in my group, we spend a lot of time in the undertow of corporate scandal trying to remind firms that there should be a better social response, right? So take that as a given. And the top S of the curve has to do with the swiftness of information. So a lot of what I want to zip through with you is how in this new book that I spent the last 8 years on, next, right? Here we go. And then you go, Tony, to the right one right here. Okay. What I want to do is left click. Okay, gotcha. Is give you some of the facts real quick. That when I was in business school at Cornell 30 almost years ago, I had the good fortune of inviting E.F. Schumacher, the author of Small is Beautiful, to the campus. And it changed my life. I was originally thinking I was going to be a doctor, and listening to speak about technology with the human face, the role of intermediate technology. It's wonderful that his book is still alive 30 years later. It just came out in the 30th edition. But I tell you this because the reason I like coming to places like Stanford or Wharton or others is that you are, in fact, the future of this S frontier. I am just coming here to report to you the things that I learned over the last 30 years. So when I was in school 30 years ago, I would read books like The Wealth of Nations or Karl Marx's Wage, Labor, and Capital, in which there was brilliant description about how the purpose of capitalism was to exploit the labor power of people in society. And that, in fact, corporations' major purpose was to allocate and accumulate capital as a means of production for self-advancement of the corporation. Now that model has worked so fiercely and so effectively that if you looked at the 100 largest economies in the world right now, 51 of them are corporations, no longer nation states. So in World Inc., I try and update the Federalist Papers, the Wealth of Nations, all of the political science material out there that looks at power from the perspective of nation states, and instead makes the argument, how do we catch up as social networks to the realm of this dominance of the modern corporation? There are massive mansions now unto themselves with great political leverage. The 100 largest multinationals in the world now control 60% of all global foreign assets. The 300 largest account for 25% of the world's total assets, and as much as 40% of the world trade now occurs within these top
It says 20, I think it mean 20 or 40, 60.
20% is what I meant. They now control 20% of global foreign assets. And as much as 40% of the world trade now occurs within these top, and I find this one the most amazing, there are only 21 nations in the world that have GDP markets larger than the annual sales of ExxonMobil, BP, Chevron, ConocoPhillips. So I originally started writing World Inc. from the perspective of oil giants and from the perspective of the probability of oil wars. So what I've now looked at is this S frontier, and I'm trying to get people to comment and be interested in what is the role of advanced capitalism in this time of swiftness of information. So there's a case on HP in the book, in the vast universe of consumer delight. And there's also chapters on Toyota's race to the top. I think yesterday you all should know that in financial history, for the first time in world history, Toyota has sold more cars in the last quarter than GM. And so if you go to the Financial Times of London, you see the cover story that the rest of the world is paying attention to is that obviously American-based firms are not necessarily always up with this swiftness of information. So I argue in this new book that Deming and Duran only got it half right when they claimed that corporations need to modernize past marks, modernize past the wealth of nations, and compete on price and quality. I've come to believe that hugely insufficient, right? That corporations must compete to create better products and more disclosing, more available leaders. And so that the corporate social responsibility movement cannot simply reside as a bag in the side of the modern corporation, because that would be like functioning in the basement while everybody else with the finance authority or product authority is running up the stairwell. Okay? So my book is written to try and make the argument that social response capitalism is an instance where we can leverage through social networks and changing laws and market forcements and investment patterns the following. And so in the limited amount of time, I want you to know that the 8 years that I spent writing this book, and my daughter's 10 years old now, so this is the only book she knows. But if you think of this as a wave, it is appropriate for the philanthropic organizations, the intellectual organizations, the NGO organizations, all of the body checks of social response to force Enron, WorldCom, Union Carbide in the undertow of the wave. They should be cleansed out of the system. And it is appropriate for the great 25-year history of the environmental social network and the energy social network to create improved laws like the ones I've spent my career working on, RCRA, Superfund, Clean Air. But that is only the bottom of the wave. The thing that's really exciting about this new century is going global is joined at the hip with going green every day of the new century. And so a larger part of the wave is money markets, where Goldman Sachs is investing $1 billion in renewables, where tomorrow and the next day at the Hotel Monaco, we have 34 of the largest corporations in the world learning from each other about how to buy renewables. So Disney wants to learn from Pacific Gas and Electric, which wants to learn from DTE, the Detroit Edison entity, which wants to learn from small renewable innovators. And this gentleman from my firm, David Fraser, is in communications every day with 100 firms that want to buy renewables. So essentially, in my book, I write about HP, Whirlpool, and Toyota in anticipation of this day, where the major press is coveraging a new world where in every industry sector, from healthcare to oil and gas to retail to pharmaceutical, firms are feeling the pressure of this wave, which is larger than regulation. So please understand that I aspired to write a book that caused some fear in the modern corporation, relative to the size of this wave. And that's in fact what we work on. We also work, as Tony noted, on how to make the next alternative high of energy that keeps our economy going, ready for the age past oil. Now, the greatest writer on this is Daniel Gergen, so I'd suggest you listen less to me and read his books, like Energy Futures. But the essence is that the era of easy oil is over, and so your generation has to be about changing the slices of the pie. Now, here's the good news. I'm going to turn it over soon to the other panelists. From '99 to 2002, my firm worked in a 5-person team for 22 people within Toyota. And I'm happy to report in detail in the book that we were able to make a shopping cart of options in a very competitive 100-year-old market that enabled us to move higher efficiency in advance of the law, because the CAFE standards only took the average North American car from 12.5 to 24 miles per gallon under the CAFE requirements. Toyota was able to increase that 43.8% aggregated across the whole fleet. In other words, they doubled the efficiency beyond the law by allowing the argument of the S-frontier. Essentially, the argument was, don't only make an eco car. Make a car that has the Camry elements to it. Make a car that has the luxury elements of a Lexus. And make a car that isn't a gas guzzler, that has the features of the family Highlander. And I would like to report to you, and hopefully we can go back and forth of it in the question, that I had the privilege of being there for those 3 years on a 5-year confidentiality, debating with Saatchi and Saatchi, when was this S-frontier finally going to hit automaking? In the book, we talk about the concerns of the modern corporation. We talk about the why they might do it. Why would firms do this? Is it only fear? Is it only panic? Or is it a kind of new resolve? And so there's a chapter in the book about the panic and resolve of leaders. And essentially, I believe they're doing it because of new energy markets, new financial flow, product differentiation, international trade development reasons. And I can't give enough credit to the NGO and the not-for-profit. Essentially, firms like HP and Toyota are doing it because they want to find new markets. They understand that the path of growth is contingent upon this. Now, in the last 2 chapters of the book, I spent 4 years going to the heads of all the valuation organizations in the world. Standard & Poor's has honored me by writing an afterword about their $2 billion entity where they essentially grade every company in the world when it doesn't handle its risks right. Okay? But this is from an alliance partner of my firm's Innovest. We've been working with them 6 years. Essentially, the 4 key intangible drivers of change are stakeholder capital, human capital. I've talked to you a lot about financial capital. There's a lot in the book because I think money does leverage world change. And I also talk about sustainable governance. The good news is I predict that within the next 5 years, the financial community will have a dashboard where for very low dollars, before you invest in a stock, you can take a reading for is the stock going to do social good or is it not? Now, Innovest products now cost $15,000 a year. I make sure all my clients get that to know where they stand, but within 5 years, that's going to be available very cheaply. I also believe that GE will rapidly come forward. Trent, in my book, I write mostly about your home, your car, the spin of your utility dial, and how to leverage change in those spaces. But through the money chapters, I also talk about how to leverage change through the global equity. So I want to convey that I'm open to talking about any of that. And so the last 2 chapters in the book are that money will not manage itself. I would encourage each of you to consider emailing David or I. The real take-home from this 20-minute talk, where I do feel guilty using a fair amount of jet fuel to get from my native New York to here, sunny California. But hopefully what you take away is that Toyota and HP are already there, trying to move up this S-curve. I think you're going to see in the next 5 years GM and Ford suffering because they haven't. Right? I believe that we need to look next at how to leverage social network pressure on Walmart, Siemens, Johnson Controls. They are the firms that are going to make all of these spaces we live in more efficient. The average industrial person, 81% of us in the world now live in urban settings, and we spend 92% of our time inside. Okay? So to make great change, you have to change the Walmart, the Siemens, and the Johnson Controls. And what I encourage you to do is, if you have a way to leverage them, please send me an email. David Fraser's our guru here on renewables. Some people in the audience know that Denny Manano's in my group. He's the former head of energy and environment at GM. So he knows how GM is suffering from not doing social response capitalism. And Rachel is a member who holds 42 global accounts for us, where we're trying from the inside to change the corporate mansion along this notion of social response. So in summary, when you read Deming and Duran, understand they only got it half right. The social leaders of the future and the business leaders of the future need to compete not just on price and quality. That is a form of senile capitalism. And all the critics of that form of senile capitalism may be wasting as much of their career as I have wasted in the last 30 years. Because I think the issue of great consequence and magnitude is how to make better leaders and better products emerge faster. That is your job in the next generation. Thank you.
I think Bruce's analysis of social response capitalism asks exactly the right question, and it's the question which I addressed in my book, which is there a market for virtue? What is the ability and capacity of companies driven by long-term profit goals to improve the world and increase the amount of social good and reduce the amount of social bad? I regret to say that my analysis of the data and the research leads me to a dramatically more pessimistic conclusion than Bruce's. I think it would be nice if there was a market for virtue in which good, responsible business practices were rewarded and less responsible business practices were punished. Unfortunately, such a world does not exist, and I see no likelihood of it emerging. We obviously can cite examples of companies which have been responsible and relatively profitable. The Business Week list, we could also cite them ad infinitum. Unfortunately, we can also cite an equally long list of companies which have been more responsible than their peers and have done very poorly in the marketplace. One thinks of Levi Strauss, Ben & Jerry's, Interface, The Gap now, and a long, long list, Chiquita Banana, of companies which have tried to do the right thing, and the market simply hasn't acknowledged them. And we can also cite a very large list of corporations and industries which continue to make enormous sums of money by behaving extraordinarily irresponsibly. The fossil fuel industry. Is there anything more profitable than discovering oil, given the higher prices of oil, given the higher prices of coal? Think of the tobacco industry. A license to print money. They just, no foreign competition, heavy brand. They just know what to do with all their profits. The gaming industry, one of America's largest and growing most profitable industries. And on and on and on. And so the real world is a very mixed picture. And you also have a lot of business activity and a lot of wealth creation which seems to have nothing whatsoever to do with corporate responsibility and social responsiveness. Yesterday's New York Times front page story, there were the top 25 earners in the hedge fund industry earned a total of $14 billion last year. Is this a market for virtue? Do they actually, is that $14 billion which is given to 25 people a reward for their social contributions? Well, I mean, I'm sure they were some useful value and efficiency, etc. But no one would ever confuse that $14 billion in personal revenue with their movement up the S curve. Now, there are a lot of problems, I think, even when we sort of try to divide, you know, relatively responsible, relatively irresponsible. One is most organizations are a mixture, right? They're like people. Most of us aren't uniformly virtuous. We're not uniformly depraved. We kind of have a little of both. I mean, and the more you look into any company, whether it's being seen as responsible or irresponsible, the more you learn how complex it is. I'll just give you one example. American Apparel. Okay, it's often considered a hero. Great labor practices. All their production takes place in a lighted, air-conditioned factory in Southern California. The workers get massages and English language training, wonderful things. Okay? I mean, their CEO has been the subject of more sexual harassment suits than most of us have had days. Is American Apparel a responsible company? Well, it depends. What your values are, right? You can look at it either way. Secondly, the other issue is that most of business activity doesn't get classified on the bottom or the top of the S-curve at all. It's irrelevant. Look at the list of, you know, the 100 leading products developed in the United States, the 100 leading brands, the 50 most rapidly growing firms. Look at the world around you and see what relevance does most of the activities have to anything to do with being socially responsible or irresponsible. It's in another world. Let me give you, again, one example. A very successful company in recent years has developed a spectacularly successful consumer product, the Apple iPod. Now, I have an iPod. My children got it for my birthday. I enjoy it. It's made my life better, et cetera, et cetera. But no one would ever argue that the Apple iPod has created social utility. And no one would ever argue that the world would be any better or worse off if the iPod didn't exist. It's irrelevant. And I think that's true with most business activities which go on, including these 25 guys who made $14 billion on managing hedge funds. The other issue has to do with causality. And here I think we can differ even more dramatically. What is the relative importance of a company's social responsibility or irresponsibility in explaining its financial performance? And my analysis would be that in most cases it is extremely modest. Take HP, one of the companies we just talked about. Okay, Carly Fiorina comes in, she has this whole big CSR agenda, does all these wonderful things, recycling, digital divide in India, people talk to her, it's all she can do about corporate responsibility. Okay, fine, wonderful. HP wins all these wonderful awards for great, and it is a very good company. It is true that she ends the company's historic commitment of no layoffs, which some might argue was pretty irresponsible, but again, it's a balanced picture, no one's perfect, we'll forgive it. Okay. Under her leadership, HP does very poorly. Does it do poorly because she's committed to social responsibility? Of course not. It has nothing to do with it. It just does poorly. She's a poor manager, makes bad decisions. Okay. Normal business stuff. HP, she's fired, there's a new CEO comes in, Heard, he does a great job. HP's turned around. Very successful, very profitable, stock booming. Did their social practices change over the last 10 years? Would any investor who was clever at predicting every fluctuation in HP's earnings and financial performance and stock price need to know anything at all about corporate responsibility to understand how HP was doing? The answer would be no. You wouldn't need to know anything at all. It's irrelevant. And I think that's true for most firms. Now let's take another example, Toyota, okay? It's probably the case that Toyota has benefited from more fuel-efficient cars, and the Prius is sort of a big hit, though it's unclear how much profit Toyota makes from it. GM and Ford, okay, they've had problems, marketing problems, energy performance problems, but they're also saddled by incredibly high labor costs, right, because of the unions and pensions and stuff. Take away, equalize the wage and labor benefits of Toyota and GM and Ford, and you would see a very, very different financial picture, which again has nothing to do with corporate responsibility. So, again, one final example of irrelevance, the Gap. Okay. The Gap is a very large firm, one of the largest in the world in terms of its sector, has done a great job on labor standards, exemplary, inspections, etc. Very impressive. Okay. The Gap is doing very poorly now. Is the Gap doing poorly because it was socially responsible? No. Is being socially responsible help the gap at all? The answer is no. Fickle consumers look around for fashion. H&M looks sexier than the Gap. They walk into H&M. Does anyone care how H&M's labor standards compare to the Gap? Does anyone say, well, I really like that T-shirt at H&M, but I remember what the great job the Gap did on labor standards. I'm going to continue to patronize them. The fact is, it's just irrelevant. I think, by the way, that's true for the financial community just responds to that. I mean, you look at the Gap, and you want to understand and predict its future earnings, you don't have to know anything about corporate responsibility. So I think, in other words, that when you look at the real world, the good news is that there is a market for virtue, that it is possible to be responsible and profitable. And there are market niches in making good products and being energy efficient, doing the right thing, organic food, Prius, et cetera, okay? Oh, and all this billions of dollars in Silicon Valley going into clean technology, some of that will prove profitable. No doubt. Not all of it, most of it won't, but of course some of it will. That's fine, right? People will make money from being more virtuous. I think that's completely true. Particularly if you run an ethical mutual fund whose business is to make money selling virtue. And if you're a CEO star consultant, of course, there's enormous money to be made in being in corporate responsibility. But the broader question is, okay, what is the relative importance of these virtuous market niches compared to the overall global economy? Compared to the overall incentives and disincentives of business students, of managers, of investors? What's their relative importance? And I would say that if their relative importance remains modest. That is to say, if you really want to make a lot of money, I would suggest you manage a hedge fund rather than developing a socially responsible fund. Now, let me give you final 2 or 3 examples where I think the limits of what markets can accomplish. One is the issue of economic inequality. Economic inequality has been growing substantially in the United States, and these guys making 25 guys making $14 billion 1 year, of course, is added a little bit to that picture. It was estimated that the average worker in an Indonesian factory making products for Nike would need to work for 45,000 years to make Michael Jordan's annual stipend. A lot of inequality. It's structural. It's built into the economy. Companies can't address this. They're exacerbating it. The gap between what CEOs pay and workers pay is increasing. It's not their fault. They're not being irresponsible. They're just driven by market forces. Market forces are promoting increased inequality. There's no way in which corporate responsibility is going to address this issue. If anything, companies' profit drive is exacerbating it. That's a serious structural problem. Limit of corporate responsibility. Secondly, global governance. We have catastrophes going on in the world today, most notably particularly in Africa. We have efforts on the part of companies to go in there, reduce corruption, improve community services, et cetera, et cetera. The fact is that none of these corporate efforts in Africa, all in the health stuff, in the Gates program, you add all of it up, all the efforts, all the charity, all the good intentions, all the microfinancing, it's a catastrophe. It's a human catastrophe. It's a human nightmare. It's getting steadily worse, not better. And that's because of the failures of government. They're governance failures. They're not corporate failures. They're public policy failures. And without sound, responsible, non-corrupt, relatively democratic governments, the best, most impressive corporate efforts of denying this will be the norm. Finally, global climate change. Well, when I went to school, I learned about externalities, which is to say, if a company does something, you do something which has negative externalities, which basically the market doesn't penalize you for, you don't pay the full social cost, you have an imbalance between private goals and public impact. That's, of course, by definition, what most environmental problems are, right? We do all this pollution, and we don't pay for it, because the people who we victimize don't have property rights that can make us pay. Okay. That's a serious market failure. We all understand this, right? Everyone in high school studies economics appreciates this. Suddenly, we're in this new world of global environmental responsibility, and those lessons we learned as sophomores in high schools about market failures seemed to have been forgotten. Suddenly, the market is capable of internalizing negative externalities. That's an audacious claim, a very audacious claim. And I think the evidence for it is very, very thin. Again, not zero. There are cases in which companies can cause negative externalities, but it's thin. The fact is that if we care about climate change, which I don't care about personally, you may not, care about climate change, all these corporate efforts on their own, and the carbon trading and the footprints and all this stuff going on, which we read about endlessly, and what you do on Earth Day, and turning off your lights and changing your light bulbs, all these, infinite number of things everyone is doing, they are going to have a trivial impact. I mean, this is just fluff, okay? It's not consequential at all. If we care about global climate change, you have to rig the prices. You have to change dramatically corporate incentives. You have to tax companies that do bad things and reward companies that do good things. You have to change the incentives of corporations. That's how we've made every single improvement in environmental policy. Not by relying on corporate responsibility, but by relying on the incentives and disincentives imposed by powerful and effective governments. One final example. The most successful environmental policy we have in the United States, arguably, is the reduction in automobile emission pollutions, other than carbon, of course, which basically the average car emits about 98% less pollution than it did in 1970. And zero less, 100% less lead. How do we accomplish this? Appealing to consumers, appealing to investors, appealing to corporate responsibility? We accomplish this by passing a law saying you have to install catalytic converters. And if you don't install it, you get fined. And if you don't install it long enough, you go to jail. And every company, screaming and yelling, has catalytic converters. And that's why the air in every American city is cleaner. And if we're serious about global climate change, or serious about solving any social problem, I think we would be poorly advised to rely on market incentives, as benign as they may be, to accomplish any of those goals.
Hey, Tony, I believe in what he's saying about the power of taxes, but
Okay.
so before we get to Elliott.
So I agree with a few of these things. I disagree with a few of these things. I think that there are, for a long time, there's been there's been very few ideas about if your interest is changing the world. There have been a very few number of accepted ways of going about it. And we've got the entire nonprofit sector that's fueled by the philanthropic sector. We've got government. I think in a global economy, relying on governments to tax and reward has some real flaws to it, unless we have some kind of a super government that makes it that means you can't just, if the government's taxing you here, you go over here. So I think there's some flaws to that. And I happen to think, self-promotingly, that social entrepreneurship holds some of the keys. The social entrepreneurship asks a different set of questions. It says if you would like to change, a societal ill, rather than try to hurt those that are causing it, or specifically reward those that are fixing it, why not create a market incentive for companies to do it on their own? Capitalism is about money. So relying on corporate social responsibility, also flawed, because that's only good if it makes more money. But if you can come up with a solution that both solves the ill and makes more money, then the market will take care of the rest. And so I think that's the value of social entrepreneurship. So here's the one social entrepreneur's perspective. The issue that I've been working on for my career has been U.S. poverty, and I think that there are a few things to understand about this. One is U.S. poverty is not even close to what it used to be. U.S. poverty used to be about unemployment. People don't have jobs, well, we can solve that. Let's create more jobs and let's help people move into those jobs. Well, that doesn't work anymore. 63% of Americans that are living below the poverty line already have jobs. And what we haven't reconciled is that we as a society tend to act when we feel the most emotional about social problems. And we feel the most emotional when we see people living in poverty who look really unhappy. And that is the very bottom rung of the folks living in poverty. Those are the people we spend the most resources on in order to move them into this place where they have some income. And that place is still poverty. So think about the amount of work it takes, both societally and individually, to move from here to here. And when you get there, you're still in poverty, and your hopes don't look that bright. That's the problem. And if we don't address that problem, then we're never going to be able to address reducing poverty. The way we've looked at it at Springboard is, if we're successful, if we can reduce poverty, if we can help a strata of people move from here up to here, who else wins? And who else wins that has resources to bring to the problem? And you could argue that government is one of those winners, and I believe that that's true, one of those winners. And you can see that there's a tremendous amount of wealth in the business sector. And so if you can figure out how business wins, you also can capitalize on it. How do you, as a social entrepreneur, leverage the existing market forces to make this problem better? And so we've identified a problem in business that is, I think, a direct result of the societal problem. People are getting jobs in the service sector. They're making $9 an hour. There's not a lot of projected growth for them to move beyond. There are no real positions above server at the cafeteria downstairs, and so people lose hope. And when they lose hope, they disengage from their jobs. And when they disengage from their jobs, they don't give a crap about the customer. Well, that affects money, and so that is a business problem. There's huge turnover in the service sector. There's and the service level in this country, I don't have any stats to back this up, but I just anecdotally feel it. Just feels like it's getting worse every day. And that affects business. So if you can solve both at the same time, then you've got something that I think can really change. So we've come up with an idea called engaged employment. If we could help people, we're working on an article this summer called Toward a Fully Engaged Workforce. And this isn't just workforce at the low level of the pay scale, it's all the way through. It's an awful lot of people I graduated from this great place from who are now doing work where they're making plenty of money, and they're miserable. They're not engaged, they don't like what they don't like their jobs, they feel shackled by the choices that they've made. This is a universal problem. If we had a society where people felt empowered to find work that they were going to be engaged by, then we would solve problems across socioeconomic. And specifically with the working poor, you would now have people in service roles who were in jobs that were stepping stones, where they were using their jobs to get somewhere else, and so they would be incented personally to care about the customer. And so that solves their own problem, and it also solves a business problem. What we actually do, and I won't go into too much detail here, but what we actually do is we've created some processes for helping people figure out what they really want to be when they grow up, helping them identify and articulate what they care most about, what they would like their lives to be about, across, not just from the 9 to 5 hours, but across, so that in order to get that, I would need this amount of money, I would need this kind of a lifestyle, I would need this amount of, lower than this amount of stress, I would need these different things. And we help people figure those things out, and then we provide everyone with their own coach. And the coach comes to the work site and works with them one-on-one to help them put their career articulation goals into practice with a coach. And then we've aligned ourselves with a company that measures engagement levels of employees, and more now, companies are doing surveys to find out how engaged their workers are, to explain why it is that their customer service is so horrible. So, and you can tie those metrics directly to business performance. So I will skip over this, other than to say, what is different is we are a nonprofit. but our long-term goal is to create so much value to the business community that businesses implement this on their own, that our organization gets funded by business, and so this doesn't rely on government and it doesn't rely on philanthropy to get it done. It relies on the market to reach huge numbers of workers rather than the kind of one at a time, community by community approach that we currently use to fight poverty. I'll skip over some of this.
No, you don't have to skip. Tony, do we have enough time, right?
Sure, we want.
Yeah. Home Depot would be an interesting case.
So we did a year and a half's worth of work at Home Depot, and this was before our alliance with Connexa, so we got anecdotal data, but the data was, there's this sort of fear that with our model that if we bring in coaches to a work site, to a place where workers are not happy, and we help them figure out what would make them happy, there's going to be a mass exodus of workers. But the reality is that that's not what's happening. Because it takes a while to figure all this stuff out and to move toward it. And if they leave and go somewhere else, they're going to lose the benefit that the company brought in of this great coaching. So people stay. And so we've seen turnover go dramatically down as a result of us coming in. We've seen managers say, boy, this is, our workers are happier and they're a lot easier to manage, so the supervisors are happy. And we see folks that were doing, the stocking in the back or the checking you out are now pursuing careers that they really want to pursue. And so it's been pretty exciting to watch. So that was a Home Depot pilot. We just recently completed a pilot in 9 Bay Area stores of a wireless carrier retail chain. And in 4 months, we saw dramatic change in engagement level of workers. These are the folks that when you take your phone if your phone's not working or your service isn't working, you stand in a long line, you're usually kind of irritated, and these are the folks that interact with you. And so their interest in staying, just in the 4-month period, almost doubled. Their perception of the service that you would get as a customer increased from beginning to end by 27%. The place where we saw the biggest difference, the number one thing that Americans report as important to them in a job is their relationship with their manager. And that's where we saw the biggest improvements. We include the managers in our coaching process, so there's a lot more communication that goes on. We saw this stat here, 93% reported that they trusted their direct managers. Frankly, I couldn't believe that stat. You don't see that in a retail environment or any kind of service environment. People felt more clear and people felt more hopeful. Just kind of another example. This is actually, we've done quite a bit of work at Stanford with Bon Appetit employees, some Bon Appetit employees and some Stanford employees in the dining services. And this is one of your fellow workers who is now pursuing a lot more. She actually is interested in the field of food service. Most people who work in food service don't have a particular interest in food service, but this person did. And she's now working toward being a chef. And just, like night and day. I mean, just night and day. She's smiling now, but she wasn't smiling before. She was just grinding it out. And so it's pretty amazing the dramatic change people can make. I won't sort of pat ourselves on the back too much, but we are in the middle of a 3-year demonstration to provide our services in a variety of different corporate environments and measure the results and demonstrate that this both helps workers and it dramatically improves the working environment and therefore benefits the companies. And the end of 3-year goal would be rather than do a pilot in one Home Depot store that maybe affects tens of people, that we get Home Depot to put this in place for 350,000 workers, and then Lowe's is going to have to do it to compete with Home Depot. And now you've got market forces reaching millions of people rather than the single numbers of people.
So now we'll open open up the panel for questions. Anyone? If you can say your name and what your question is.
Sure. My name is Matt Vanderslice. And to me, the sort of fundamental question with all of this is climate change. If James Hansen from NASA, who directs all their climate work, says we have 10 years to fundamentally restructure the way we deal with energy, and people are talking about needing to eliminate 80% of our global warming pollution, how the hell does that happen with corporate structures? How the hell do you internalize that much? And if it's products that create emissions, cars that create emissions, etc., we can create those, they'll be great. But it's also land use and the size of your home, and you can't make a home that feels like 15,000 square feet, but actually only has 3,000 square feet in the home. How does the market handle it?
Who are you addressing the question to?
All three.
Yeah. I'll dive in first. I think Matt has hit the issue on the head, and I think that the first two things that I learned from Elliott's presentation is that in order to get the vast amount of people engaged on the climate issue, you have to give them a chance to care about something. I think that throughout human history, from Joan of Arc to Winston Churchill to Abe Lincoln, if people indulge in the absence of care, and it could be anything, intellectual cynicism, incomplete view of the world, the disadvantage of not having the privilege of a good education, right? All of those things are related. If we just do not change the focus on who the political will people are, these last 8 years have been miserable in terms of the repression of science relative to climate change. So there have been other dismal times in human society. I mean, it is unfortunate that when I was writing my book, trying to look at the climate change problem, you all should know that in 1990, in my first book, In Search of Environmental Excellence, I wrote on climate change. So for 17 years, I've been waiting to see how to answer your question. So I think you've asked the right question. The thing that I want to throw on it is that unless mass communication, the media, and the people who are the thought leaders, the opinion makers of society, get beyond the cynical, the intellectual, and the despairing, we will never catch up. So that's my moral point. And I hang out with people like Bill McKibben, who really, in 1990, wrote a better book than I did on the end of nature. So I think there's a lot of text out there. It's not just Chris Hansen and Stephen Schneider from the scientific point of view. There's been a lot of people trying to persuade mass society. So it is a social good when a guy like Al Gore, I was on his White House Council on Environmental Technology, it is a social good when he wins the Oscar, because there's a fair amount of change that happens when you mainstream these messages, right? So it is possible that we will not get off the petrochemical treadmill in time, but it is also certain that we'll never start getting off it unless we learn how to care and take action on these issues, without cynicism or without intellectual wheel spinning.
Just make one quick comment. I mean, I think caring is important, and I think there's a lot of win-win possibilities in climate change, lots of things, people can do, companies can do, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, serious reduction in carbon emissions is going to cost money. Basically, in America, 40% of our energy comes from coal, right? There's no way coal can be made, can be burned in a way that's going to effectively ameliorate its carbon footprint. I mean, it's just, I think it's impossible, okay? Well, I mean, that means that, or if we did so, it would be extremely expensive. I mean, Americans are going to have to pay a lot more for gasoline, a lot more for energy, a lot more for all the products which use energy. And caring is nice, but it'd be nice if people were willing to pay some more money. And I don't see much of a willingness to make sacrifice for people. And I think unless people are willing to make sacrifices, and shareholders are willing to make sacrifices, and companies are willing to make sacrifices, you're not going to get much done.
I just want to respond because obviously, if any of the three of us knew the, if we knew the answer to this, we'd just be doing it. So I think obviously the big issue is that we don't know how to do it. If I were trying to solve it, which I'm not, I would ask the question: who else wins if we succeed, and who loses if we fail? And if you can figure out who those players are, and you can provide provide incentives for them to start solving the problems, you're going to start seeing solutions. I was saying the big joint venture Silicon Valley, the big Silicon Valley conference this last year was on, where Al Gore was the keynote, was on green tech, clean tech. That is a very recent phenomenon. I don't think that's going to go far enough. But if you look at if John Doerr from Kleiner Perkins is investing most of his money in ideas that make this better, banking on the fact that that's where the future is going, you're going to see an awful lot more private sector solutions. So if I were trying to solve it, I would be asking those questions: who would be the winners, who would be the losers, and how could we create things that would incent them to go solve it?
That's exactly right. Tony, you're our moderator.
Yes. Well, I have a personal problem, which is that I may have created a solution for capitalism, a true externalities market that everybody's always been dreaming of. The problem is that I don't have a way to propagate it because it's not actually a business that I would get into. In other words, it's not something I would do to make money, which is the best way to propagate something, is then you can reinvest your profits into marketing and spread an idea and so on and so forth. So the problem with this idea is, how do I get it out there fast enough, and also, I don't know if it's true or not, so I really haven't gone to it's only a 45-page paper that I wrote at this point, but where is this? I mean, you're a nonprofit, so you have a little bit more idea of the problem that I'm dealing with here, but still ultimately you're going to be self-financing. So where do I go when I want to engage in this dialogue, put the solution in front of people, which is not something I'm going to go to Kleiner Perkins and get a bunch of VC money for?
Oh, you want to take that?
Sure. Well, my first question would be, does getting the idea out there do anything? Is it going to be good enough to have the idea out there? I would be thinking about who wins. Who would be the winners? If you put that idea out there and people adopt it, who wins?
Everybody wins.
Well, who wins financially?
Well, it's...
I'm not asking.
Yeah, I mean,
but I'm saying that's what I would be thinking about.
Yeah, well,
is who would the winners be? Then let them fight over each other to be the first ones to it. But you've got to. It isn't. I'm not sure it's going to be enough to. I'm not sure it's going to be enough to put your ideas out there. You're going to have to figure out who would win and why they would want to take a risk on implementing. And that would be my.
One of the things I'd like to say that's interesting about your comment is that you're showing the three principles that I try and get into in the book. You have an engagement in a social problem. You're not thinking about something, I hope, like a non-addictive cigarette. Like David brings up how tobacco is a huge waste. You're not thinking, the first thing you have is engagement in a social problem. And the good news is that as I travel around the world, there are more and more smart new generation people having some social engagement. They're interested in the path of a social solution. So that's one thing you got going for you. And believe it or not, rapid social networks will come around depending on the quality of the idea. I think you're also getting clear about obstacles. And one of the fundamental things about success in society is, unless you're clear about the obstacles, that Elliott was getting to it about who's going to win and who's going to lose, who's competing in this marketplace of ideas for your approach. But I also think that society evolves with people having tremendous persistence and hope. And I sense in you someone who is hopeful about
I'm
this.
not.
You're not. So
No.
then it might not happen. Then it might not happen.
No, yeah.
Yeah.
I feel very, so Jeannie Rosenthal, I'm an MBA here. I feel very similarly to Professor Vogel, and it was great to hear the realism in what you were talking about. But there is this fundamental conflict. You know, the government knows what's the right thing to do, and they're not doing it. So I guess my question to you is, what are the pressure points? Is it campaign finance reform? Is it just, pushing, working really hard? I mean, I guess both individually as a person, what can we do, and then also as a society, what should we be thinking about to, contradict this American genome of like no regulation?
I mean, I think we have regulation. We just have enough. I mean, I think the first step is to expand our expectations and definition of corporate responsibility to include not simply what a company does voluntarily in the market, all this kind of stuff, but its stances vis-a-vis public policy. I would like to see Inverness, for example, rate companies by their lobbying positions, right, which of course it does not do. And no, by the way, none of the social funds and the rating services ever even look at corporate political preferences and activity. And I think that a company's policy preferences and their lobbying on global climate change is going to be much, much more impactful in the long run than anything it does voluntarily. So I think the first step is to begin to pressure companies and tell them that we are going to hold them socially accountable, not only for the CSR things, which are important, but also for their political positions. And I think the people who work in companies, I think they need to sort of focus on how they can get their firms themselves to have a more responsible attitude towards appropriate public policies. I think that, in the climate change area, there's a lot of encouraging developments in the last 6 months. Though largely due, of course, to the Democratic takeover of Congress. I think they would not have happened without that. But a lot of companies are now turning around and recognizing that we do need some regulation, we do need some standards, we do need a level playing field, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's very encouraging. And I think, one way in which the CSR movement has played a useful role is if you pressure a company to do stuff, and it turns out it's not very cost effective, well, then they have a financial interest in getting everyone else to do it. So I think there is a dynamic between the two. But I think the first step is to put it on the CSR agenda where it's not been at all.
Bruce, you really tweaked an interest in me. My name is Bud Conrad. In the sort of very big picture, pointing out that corporations are bigger than most countries. And it brought another problem because I think our government is too big. But I see this sort of have and have not social class distinction as overwhelmingly getting worse, and over which I have no problem. I think many of the problems that I fear or worry about are exacerbated by this. And my only solution is more like probably yours, revolution, political change, or something on the very big level, not what can I do personally. And of course I have no effect at all, like the gal over here was suggesting maybe political wealth. I sort of feel like there's this, and I think you're going to be hopelessly ineffectual in moving lower class people into the middle class as the middle class implodes because of the geopolitical situation. I mean, maybe helped in small cases, but it's a tough road to hoe in the very big picture of dealing with this very big. So my question is, short of revolution, can you think of what we do? Or do you advocate revolution?
Yeah, I think, Bud, I appreciate your question. I think the most pragmatic position to take is to realize how much power exists in the swiftness of information and in society to body check bad behavior and make it better.
So the internet can stand up against corporate media?
Yeah, what I've come to believe is that a lot of the changes that I'm seeing, so for example, Elliott talks about Home Depot. A week ago, Home Depot says that they're going to eco-label 2,000 of their products, not just fluorescent lights and flooring, but 2,000. And then by 2009, they're going to have it to 12% of their product share. Now, what's interesting about that is it does have elements of the voluntary to it. In other words, no one is telling Home Depot to do it. So the failure of governments and the failure of the press to articulate what Home Depot should be doing, right, is being outsmarted by something else that I tried to think about in my new book. Because if you understand, like David says, it is insufficient to expect companies to change on a voluntary basis. They have to change because of this wave I'm describing, all right? So the thing that I would like Bud you to think about in terms of where is the next generation of true talent and insightful workers going to come from, right? And I would suggest that the reason why the reviewers are saying my book is kind of a follow-up to Tom Friedman's is I'm not sure that education for new recruits is only going to come from the best business schools. I think it's going to come from the street of hard knocks. And I think that Elliott's approach is very hopeful in the sense that the people who are making change in the world are not necessarily the people like me who are thinking about making change. So you have to make that distinction. That is the most pragmatic distinction to make. And that the people who are working hard in new ways, right, that are finding value in society, are not necessarily the people that are thinking about it. So my motto has always been, actors speak of real things as if they're, imaginary. It's just great. But that academics can sometimes speak of imaginary things as if they're real. You have to flip what pragmatism is. It's all about action. So in my book, I talk about a personal fulcrum where you can actually leverage change through what you wear, what you buy, what you drive, how long you keep your computer on. And probably one of the best ways to escape the dismal about poverty and so forth is to think in a very Marcus Aurelius type of way. What can I do for my own needed self? All right. So I would like all you to know, since I'm telling a life story here, when my father died when I was 3, my mother had $17 in the bank. All right. And it's because of people like Elliott who are actually making change, the social workers I got to live with, that I actually added some books to my library. They gave them to me. Okay. So I think it's important to realize a profound cultural idleness that's existing in North America right now about thinking about making desperate change versus all of those folks that are out there that are actually making change. So so I'm at a point in life where I'm trying to write something that's stimulating change as opposed to something that's further articulating despair. So I used to go back and forth with Al Gore when I was on his White House council. And I learned a lot from him. He's not as stiff as he appears in public. But essentially, the reason why Earth in the Balance didn't work back then, even though he was a prophet, was because it was too despairing, too desperate, right? And so I've come to the point where I more agree with the Bill McKibbins, who think that the only way you can address climate change is through moral persuasion and restraint. And I'll also leverage over companies, because the regulation will never be fast enough. Now, please understand that I testify on behalf of carbon taxes. I think you got to tax, like David Vogel is saying. You have to tax bad behavior. But the question is, how do you stimulate care and innovation on a massive scale? Because otherwise, we're going to just never catch up to these issues.
Within Springboard, I'm curious what you're actually doing to change these people's opportunities, because you mentioned that lack of hope was one of the fundamental problems. And to further that to the issue of climate change, I find that it's really hard for me and other people who work on this issue to convince anybody that any sort of action and caring that they have will actually make that sort of difference. And even though I tell all my classmates, yes, it's really important to do these types of things, I don't think it's quite there. And I also wanted to comment on the issue of revolution. The guy who just went down. I'm kind of skeptical about, especially our generation and our willingness, appetite for revolution. I just don't think that we operate in that way. So I'm curious if anybody has comments on those points.
Well, I'll start since you asked about Springboard, but I think the first sort of overarching comment for me is that I actually think that the biggest enemy to all of this is pessimism. You can't just because what you've seen isn't working, you can't give up, because that's what everyone else has done. So you've got, if it's not working, then I would say you're not trying hard enough, or you haven't come up with the right idea. There are a ton of people out there with ideas that are working. And if you go to like a Skoll Foundation site or a Ashoka site, or you're going to see people, individual people, who are creating ideas that where they did figure out the win. I mean, we're a very small we're a blip. But there are some organizations, the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, social entrepreneur, Muhammad Yunus, one guy. So, if you find yourself giving up, then you should be challenging yourselves to care more yourselves. That's the first thing I would say. But you know, the idea that you can think sort of from a structural level about, well, so you got all these, we're talking about poverty, you've got all these people down here, and then you've got the wealth up here, and that gap's getting bigger, and this middle class is shrinking, and economists are being pessimistic. I just don't believe it. I just don't believe it. People say, well, if you move all these people up, then what's going to happen to these people? Like, I just don't believe that's how it works. We had this idea for years and years that as technology started to be able to replace people, that we're going to have all these people out of work. Well, I haven't seen it happen yet. And I haven't seen anything there. What the economists are predicting is we're going to have a labor shortage. So I just don't believe that if these folks start finding paths for themselves and moving into them, that's going to create, that has to create a problem. But I would love to find out. And you know, the other thing is we're an entrepreneurial society. I think that's what's exciting about social entrepreneurship, is that it is actually possible for individual people to create and have the thing grow. And that's true in the social sector, and it's true in when you talk about workers. It's not like all of the people who are slinging hash are going to all move into this new job that was here and displace all these other people. They're going to start their own restaurants. They're going to start their own construction businesses. They're going to create. That's what we do. We create. So I think part of the I would say challenge of this generation is start thinking about what if it were possible, and less about, oh, woe is me, I don't know, it just seems like pretty hopeless.
I'd like to try and build just real quick. Go ahead, David.
Just want to get the words.
Okay.
Well, I was just going to comment. You made a comment before that you don't work on these issues, working on poverty. Poverty is probably one of the biggest contributors to these issues, in my view, throughout the world. So we're doing a ton of work to these issues. And I think we got to remember that the issues of climate change involve everything from poverty to land degradation to biodiversity, everything else. You can't solve it by just looking at energy. You can't look at it one way or another. China's going to be a huge player in climate change if they don't jump past poverty and a lot of those other issues, just going straight through coal. I mean, most of your CO2 emissions are going to come from that area. So, you know, one of the first titles that we worked on in this book involved revolutionary. I wanted it to be a bloodless revolution of the 21st century as our subtitle to the book. It is a revolution, and you can't be afraid of taking on a revolution as our generation. One of the best things about working with Bruce is all the little books that he passes on to me on the side. And on the way out here, I read Short History of Myth by Karen Anderson. Great little book, just going through what mythology really was, looking all the way back to, you know, in the BC era and so forth, and how it evolved in, you know, through cultures and into religion and so forth. There hasn't been any change since Western civilization, since Christ basically, and since we've decided that we're going to be Western thinking. There hasn't been a revolution since then, as far as ethos go throughout culture, which is kind of scary to me. It's kind of like, you know what? If it is 10 years, there's going to be a big change because people are going to have to change. maybe that is the answer, that it is just, you know, a big bang and everybody does it. But I'd like to think that I can at least fight and try and make sure there's a change that isn't just a big, you know, I have to do it. You know, it's kind of, you know, I'm at least trying to get there myself. And I think that's what you see with a lot of these companies. You see Green Mountain Coffee Roasters, a guy that their CEO, he actually went to school for divinity. And he's like, I want to do something better, you know? So he's made himself a very successful company focused in a small niche. I mean, you see these niche companies. Don't be dissuaded by companies like Gap that aren't making it. Yeah, that's our system. Not all companies are going to make it on the same thing. But what you do see is a lot of companies that are making it by being socially responsible, by looking at climate change and looking at other things, and be inspired by those companies and be like, hey, you know what? Everybody says that climate change is going to cost you way too much money to do it. A lot of companies are making a shitload of money off of looking at climate change, looking at your efficiencies, saving millions upon millions of dollars at doing this, you know? That's what we have to look towards, not looking at, hey, yeah, there are going to be a few companies that just don't make it. Gap, maybe, I didn't even know Gap does anything. I work in this field all the time. I barely know that Gap does anything. Maybe they just don't brand it or market it correctly. There could be a lot of different reasons why they don't make it. So, 2 cents.
A question really for Elliott and maybe for the other 2 panel members. When I look at what you're doing, and in many respects, I look at you providing a service to corporations in converting what a couple of you call intangibles or externalities into tangible kinds of activities. And in other words, your information they need from return on investment or whatever internal financial methodology they use to make a decision, you're helping them convert that. There's a potential here, I think, maybe for those kinds of efforts combined with this speed of information to perhaps to continue to move these kind of ideas forward. Any comments with regard to that? Are these the kind of efforts that potentially will support corporate decisions that are more financially oriented, which is Dr. Vogel, you're espousing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm banking on it.
Because as a, coming from a corporation, we don't think about those kind of things. When we have our plate's pretty full, and we're not necessarily going to think about these kind of details. But if someone walks in the door and says, hey, do you know that if you had this kind of impact on retention, et cetera, that if you have this financial result, if we can vet that kind of information, corporations would make those kind of decisions based on the financial.
I mean, I think that the key fulcrum on the financial markets, and Bruce obviously talked about that, and he talked the vision in which you go online, you'll look at a share, and your stocking will understand the information about its social environmental performance, et cetera. I realize, I appreciate that could make a big difference. I just don't see that happening. It certainly hasn't happened yet. When I was writing my book, just as a bit of field research, I decided to subscribe to Investor Daily. And so I read Strawford for a year. It came every morning. And I would flip through it and look for any reference. This is, you figure, relevant to investors, buy and sell stock all day long. Any reference to anything to do with social, environmental issues, positive, negative, any context. And the whole year, I never came across one. And if you're interested, do an experiment. Go online. You want to buy a stock and all these financial services, and you click on a stock, right, and they give you the reports about, buy, sell, hold, prospects, earnings, stuff. Pick any stock, including actually firms like GE, and Hewlett Packard, and firms that have some CSR reputation, and see how often they ever mention as material anything to do with social environmental performance. The answer is just about never. Okay? I mean, you could read every financial report on Nike for the last 10 years and know nothing whatsoever about their labor practices. And that, I think, is exactly right, an information problem, which is to say, investors have finite time. They can't worry about everything. They can't factor in everything. And at the end of the day, these social environmental issues for most investors simply fall below the radar screen because they don't adequately impact on prices and shareholder value. I think that's a very fundamental problem. And these hedge funds, show me, they're making the problem worse, not better. so many a socially responsible hedge fund. I mean, this whole world of trading on Wall Street is actually becoming, is terrifying companies, right? And making them much more anxious and concerned about short-term financial performance. And I think these broader trends going on and the trends of private equity, I think these pressures in the long run are going to make it harder for companies to act responsible, not easier, on balance. I'm very pessimistic.
I'll tell you what I think is one of the fundamental flaws in the way that we're thinking about change. Take climate change. We care about it. I put myself in the category of we care about it, and we want others to care about it, and we want them to care about it enough so that they'll do something about it. And we're frustrated because they don't.
That's her question.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so you can, if you keep trying to get them to care about what you care about by just telling them over and over again and giving them information, you're gonna end up frustrated and pessimistic. I don't think that's the right. I don't think that's the right question. I don't think that's the right question. I think the right question. I just got a piece of business advice that was incredibly simple and incredibly helpful. Before you start talking, find out, ask the question, what are the 3 things that keep you up at night? What are the 3 things that you care about the most? You're coming into a conversation hoping that they're going to care about what you care about, but you didn't even ask them, what do they care about? Ask them what they care about. Ask the CEO of Exxon what keeps him up at night. And once you find out, then try to come up with a way that what you're doing will impact what he cares about, and now you're going to start seeing change.
It's very insightful. It's not global climate change.
but that's the point. Of course it is, right? It's shareholder value. It's right.
So when he retires, will he get that incredible $150 million deal that his predecessor got? That would probably keep him up at night.
That's the glass. Oh,
Yes, sorry.
that was glass half empty. So glass half full is, think about the impact of the information that you have on the $150 million buyout. Think about.
I think it was 4.
Think about that. If you can make that connection, then you're going to start getting people.
Why don't we just get some more questions? Go ahead.
Moderator,
Go ahead.
okay, so, it just seems to me, going off Professor Vogel's points, as well as some of the ones that David made, and really, it seems that really what the issue is it's a lack of information, and essentially a lack of a market. Like, people, you can get people really excited about talking about, revolution, talking about change. And that can go only so far, though. I think really the only way you can make it happen is by creating a market. And, granted, I think that, yes, strong government is a big factor, but, like somebody else brought up, the moment we crack down here in the United States, what are you going to do about China? We can't control, by regulating here at home what's happening in China. So really what it seems like the thing that really is needed at this point is to kind of help create some kind of, essentially an index, like a social responsibility index.
You have 1 million of those.
But realistically, only now, you look at over the past 6 months, over the past year, really, and the changes that have been occurring and the fear in the people, which is really starting to develop, as they see these incidents go on with the weather, and see as the world is actually changing right now. And I think if we really start focusing on those, and creating a market essentially for it, that's really, and then showing the companies that, hey, they can make money by doing this. I think that's really going to be the only way you can actually create change.
I think, we talk predict the future. I think one good prediction, though, is that nothing that is important now will remain as important a year from now. I think that's a good prediction, buttressed by several thousand years of history. I'd be interested to see, without wanting to sound too cynical, I mean, I welcome and appreciate all this enthusiasm and groundswell of interest in global climate change, environmental responsibility, all these dimensions. We're seeing to see 5 years from now what it looks like.